Welcome everyone. This time I'd like to respond to a question that I received about teaching children how to do zazen, how to do this making Buddha practice that we do as Zen people. The story begins after I finished graduate school. I got an opportunity while I was living in a Zen temple to work with children with special needs. I can't recommend that highly enough for anybody. You really learn a lot about how much heart you have to give to children, to anyone, when you take care of people who probably aren't ready to take care of themselves. Could become able to, but largely can't. You know, children who live in a wheelchair, for example, or people with Down syndrome or autism. They teach us such wonderful things about our own humanity by demonstrating living purely by the power of their own hearts. And I think you'd be hard pressed not to be touched if you spent time with children in those circumstances. And I noticed that when I spent time with those kids, the calmness that I could bring from my zazen practice seemed to kind of rub off on them in a way that was the atmosphere that we create around ourselves as a teacher or as an adult with any children really it sets a tone. Children are very receptive to this. And for children who could get very escalated really quickly over very small things, small details not being how they expect, being calm and entirely non-judgmental, with the exception of safe or unsafe, really creates a safe space. That's a really simplistic way to put it. I know that lots of people are going to have great comments down below about their experiences far beyond my own, and bring it on. I'm very interested. I'd love to get into it with you. But at least in my own experience, I was struck by how I could bring that orientation to stillness and silence and put it, kind of wear it like a great robe. I wasn't a monk at the time, but wear it like a robe, and the children could find safety in that space. So fast forward a little bit, I got called back to Chicago, where I worked in a very progressive school and under a wonderful boss who is on another video called Identity and Practice. I made maybe a month ago or so. Dr. Jean Robbins was my boss. We practiced maybe a couple times a week before work, and I knew that she had a long history as a meditator, as a contemplative person, and as a Buddhist practitioner in the Shambhala tradition. And I talked with her about leading some meditation for the students that I was working with. The kids were 5. It was an American kindergarten classroom, and she was very amenable to it. Indeed, it was really popular at the time. I don't know if it's still so popular now, given our political climate, but at the time, the mindfulness movement was an exciting thing for a lot of people. And getting children to become more mindful, how could that possibly be a bad thing? However, the crux was that children in that time, and perhaps now too, because the idea of mindfulness was floating around in the air, got an idea. They could inoculate themselves from taking it up as an activity because they had been hearing whispers on the wind, and developed preconceived notions about what the thing was. And so they would say, yeah, kids can do that. Any of us can do that, honestly. So I thought, what better way to dissociate the activity of, well, not exactly mindfulness, but of doing a meditation thing from the word meditation than using a word that they'd never heard. Well, the easiest word that they'd never heard was zazen, so I used it. And I used it with permission, and it worked. After all, it only means sit and concentrate. So, well, what harm could there be in that? It's not a religious thing to do. Just sit. No religion there, just sitting. And I began to invite the students to sit with me every day, sometimes twice. In the beginning, for the first time, I kind of took a page out of the Deshimaru book. For those of you who know who Deshimaru is, I think there's some movies of him climbing up on a table and just, twisting his legs up in zazen and just sitting. And then people watch this and go, whoa, that's crazy. What is he doing? That's nuts. And it is. And it's really cool. So what I got into was a situation of showing rather than explaining what zazen is. Thank you, Deshimaru, for setting that example. So what I did is I didn't climb on a table. That's a little bit too outlandish for a classroom full of 5-year-olds. But I brought a zafu and I put it in the middle of the floor and I sat down on it. I did the whole routine. I bowed to my seat. I bowed to the room. The kids have never seen anybody put their hands together like this and bow. It looks crazy. And I didn't say anything. And the lead teacher took my advice, which was, no matter what happens, let it be. No judgment, don't need to speak. In fact, the not speaking is the most powerful impression that we can make if we're going to introduce this with its full potency. And I sat down, perhaps a minute or so, and then I looked at the children and I asked, what are we doing? And then I kind of laughed to myself. I spoke slowly and softly, and I got answers like, I don't know, that's a common one, and nothing, yeah, nothing. And I also got answers like, just sitting, and I said, yeah. This has a name. So I said zazen, and the kids got that word put in their brain. Oh, this silent experience, this just sitting thing has a name. So now it has a structure. It's like a glass for holding water. And so I took the children and introduced the idea that anyone could do it. Would anybody like to try? And a few kids raised their hand. What they didn't know is that they already were doing it. They were sitting quietly. Even the wild children who had all that emerging energy and inability, depending on their developmental stage, to sit still were effectively doing zazen just by proxy. And some kids said, yeah, I'd like to try. And then other kids said, no, I don't want to try it. And I said, oh, that's okay. Well, how can we be fair to our friends who want to try? And I coax out the answers. Well, we can let them try. Well, what do we have to do to let them try? Well, I suppose we have to wait. I said, well, can you do that? Can you give that gift to our friends who would like to try this? And they're like, yeah, okay. And so especially in the beginning, because eventually children get used to something and start going crazy again, and that's normal, that's fine. But the children sat and waited in order to let their friends do the thing. Do you see what happened? By asking them to allow other people to do the zazen, the just sitting, they began to just sit. It was a funny trick, and it worked every time for 3 years. The introduction was the same thing, and then on every given day every day that we had the opportunity, which was most days, it would be a really special, weird day that we didn't do at least a few moments in the morning. A really busy, spectacular day often was set up best by doing zazen, of course. So inviting the children to sit together before a very exciting day was often a really great thing to do. Most, by doing it over time, became interested in not forgetting to do zazen together. After the introduction, going on to the next days and weeks and months of at least inviting the children to engage in zazen practice together, a really interesting pattern emerged. Of course, there were a few kids who were really into it, and they would just not let me forget that we need to do zazen together, which was awesome. There were also children who began to try to inoculate themselves from the activity. Because of, children change about every 3 months around the five-year age, and they have this sort of balanced, unbalanced pattern that they go through. And some kids would become antsy and over-energetic, and they could not sit still and participate in that thing. But that became great practice for the other children, who then were falling into a balanced state for a couple of months, a couple of weeks. And what happened is, I would ask the children, well, No, this kid cannot sit still. He's going to do something crazy. If we're going to do zazen together, what do we need to do to have a successful zazen? You know, we all talked about it, and the kid who was feeling pretty wild would probably laugh. I would never do that as a put down. Sometimes you just can't help it. And that was also a point that was important to make to the children. Sometimes you can't help it, and you're just you have to run around, you have to laugh, you have to play, you have to make noise. You're a child, that's okay. For some of us who want to sit still together for a few minutes, what do we need to do? The obvious answer, which came out beautifully, is nothing. Just nothing. I don't have to respond to this other kid having a big behavior because right now I'm just sitting. I don't need to interact with that. That's exactly what my sitting is not interacting with it. Sometimes kids would look and their attention would wane, or maybe somebody would do something quite silly and some kids doing zazen might laugh in the beginning. But what happened over time, by the second month, that laughing was largely turned off. So children began naturally with the patience that sometimes they can and sometimes they can't, and that's okay. And sometimes their friends can and sometimes their friends can't, and that's also okay. They began to be great little zazen doers. So you might be wondering, how long could a child sit zazen? How long can a 5-year-old actually sit still? And the answer is, really, not very much. Not very much at a stretch. Mostly when you get a child to sit still, it's like pressing on a big spring. As soon as you let up, all the energy comes bursting out. And that's okay. Actually, one of the things that children start to do is they recognize that their energy bursts out, and some of them begin to notice, sometimes by seeing other children, and then later by seeing themselves, that they could control that release and then stand up from the seat in a calm way. Which, if you can imagine being a parent of a child who is learning to manage themselves by doing this practice and then becoming that self-aware and functional with it, mind-blowing, right? There were parents who were overjoyed. There were probably parents who didn't like it, but for the most part, it was a good thing. As for the time, usually it was 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes. Sometimes we got as long as 5 or 6. And by the end of the school year, after we had practiced zazen for, 8, 9 months, children wanted to try and see if they could go even longer. Then we would try a couple times to get close to 10 minutes. That only worked after a long period of visiting it every day. That's how it works for adults, and even for children. Do it a little bit every day for a long time, and then all of a sudden your response to how it feels in practice matures, calms down, and you can keep sitting in spite of what you feel inside or experience on the outside. I would like to recommend that people try this with their kids, but I think it also might be really difficult in a home context. Not impossible, but difficult. If you're a parent and you're thinking about trying to get children to do something like zazen or just still sitting, you could use a placeholder word like zazen with which they have no association in order to trick them into engaging the activity without preconceived notions or implicit biases about what that thing might be because they've heard about it in the media or around school or in a book or on YouTube, for example. But the only way that the potency of showing a child how to just sit works is if you bring that orientation to stillness and silence in yourself out in front of the children. That's the only way that it can work. So if you haven't engaged the practice and you want to do it with your kids, just wait. Do it by yourself first and then invite your children into that practice with you. Zazen is ultimately about non-judgment, about holding everything with an open hand. And that means that even the idea of being successful in zazen is held with an open hand, in an open hand. You can't make children do anything. You can't make a person do zazen. They have to want to do it themselves. That's the only way in. And that's great. How do you create the conditions that make it easy to enter the practice of zazen. That's dependent entirely on the adult's development of practice. Another inside aspect of teaching children to do zazen and creating that example for them to fall into is, of course, they learn to notice that when they get up from the sitting, their energy explodes like a loaded spring. Well, yeah, there's that. But there's also this part of how do we turn the attention of a child to their body? Because often when we're kids, we don't think too much about it unless we get hurt. And then that pain becomes this huge thing in our attention and we cry, it's unusual, everything is generally pleasurable and fun, and then all of a sudden this is painful and that becomes this huge dramatic thing. Well, let me tell you, if a child has this repeated encounter with stillness and silence, then almost any conversation that happens sort of about that in any other context is informed by that orientation, that practiced orientation. That's the practice of zazen, of course. So the children, of course, like I said, begin to notice when they get up from the stillness, there's a huge explosion of energy, like releasing a loaded spring. But that's in the context of doing zazen. With daily visiting, and I mean daily, it has to be daily. Anytime in any other context that you have a conversation about noticing self, noticing body, or noticing thoughts, the way a child can respond and turn their attention, because it's practiced. It's like a well-honed knife. It's sharp. It goes straight to the point. You can bring their practiced stillness to their awareness. For example, a child starts playing really hard or is kind of pushing boundaries as children do, and maybe they're kind of being zany. And you might want to draw the child's attention to themselves in order to calm down, in order to remember how to be calm. But if they don't know that they're not calm, they might not know that it's even possible to shift into a calm state. And one of the ways you can do that is, if you have a good relationship with that child, you can put your hand on the kid's heart and say, "What's happening in there? What's that?" They might know it's a heart, they might not, and you probably don't even need to say it. You just put their hand under yours, or their hand can be on top of yours, and they're still gonna feel it because your hand is there. They're having that association with, this is the place I'm turning my attention to. And their heart's beating really fast, and you can ask them some leading questions. Well, how does it feel? What's happening there? And they're like, oh, something's going really fast. Da, 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 da. And you might ask, how are you breathing? And they say, I'm breathing really fast. Or you can coax them into paying attention. And then what happens is, almost by virtue of just noticing, it slows down. If it hasn't slowed down, because sometimes it doesn't, you don't have to call it an object meditation, but you can give them an object meditation. Like, take a deep breath. Blow it out. Do it once more. Blow it out slow. I think most people watching my channel probably know that on the exhale, our heart rate slows down just a little bit. We can use that on children to calm them down just a little bit. It doesn't always work, but practicing it, I mean, that's what practice is. It doesn't always work. It's failure over and over and over, and doing it again and trying again. And that's how the magic begins to emerge. And I would like to say that if we could all practice the stillness and silence ourselves as adults, and then invite the children around us to do that too, I think it might make the world a better place. And why do I think it might make the world a better place? It's for a lot of reasons which you're already thinking. But more than that, from the words of the children that I taught this stuff to, over 3 years, some of the insights that I experienced coming out of the mouths of children, the mouths of babies, was just breathtaking. You can't imagine the feeling. And the other teacher, she was not a Buddhist or a meditator or anything like this, just a really good, thoughtful person with a wide open outlook on the world. And we sat in kind of a conversation time, and I remember a little boy having a reflection one time. I think he told me out of the blue, if I remember correctly. He came up to me and said, you know, I think we're all the same thing. Like, there's not really any difference between me and my friends or these other people in the class. I mean, some are my friends, but some are not my friends. But even then, there's nothing different here. I think we all want the same thing. And I think we can all be friends and be fair and feel happy. It's like, that's like weirdly deep, kid. You're 5. What's going on there? He began to sit on his own sometimes, in addition to the time that we would sit together. We would go to the playground, and he might figure out that being still was as stimulating and interesting as running around and chasing everything. When he would get up and he would run and play, be a kid too, but he'd also stop sometimes because he recognized that there was something really magical there. And he was really good at being friends with everyone, including everyone. And I think other children began to do that better too, even if in the beginning they weren't so concerned with the people who weren't their immediately interesting friends. The people who were not so interesting, even the people who weren't so interested in them, they were still demonstrating sort of a spontaneous compassion, a spontaneous inclusion. Well, inclusion, if I say that, that starts to sound kind of political, doesn't it? Well, I mean including. Everyone's in this together, and that even kids can pick up on that. And if children can even pick up on that, then it must be next to the root of us being human beings, no? Let there be more discussion in the comments below or in the emails you can send me at askeshin@gmail.com. In closing, what I'd like to say is, if children can be invited into our practice of orienting ourselves to stillness and silence, and they also have access to great and profound wisdom, the ungraspable standard before measurements, the thing that Siddhartha Gautama sat in a forest to study, because he didn't sit there trying to figure out Buddha. He just tried to see the great matter of all of it, life and death, and what it means to be in community, friendship. If children can access that spontaneously, so can you and I. So how could we dispense with practice? So get after it, people. Let's go manifest Buddha.